Hello and welcome to lecture 2 for this week. This will be on structure and function and then looking at all levels of organization. So let me share my screen with you here. All right, structure function. So you saw in the first video, this is one of the main themes in anatomy and physiology. And we'll be talking about it today at the importance of it at all levels of organization and about what I mean by that. Again, so first of all, structure function, that's just talking about how structures or anatomy help to determine function or physiology. So the shape of a hammer is different than the shape of a wrench. The structures of those tools determine what you do with them, their functions. So structure function is really saying anatomy and physiology, clearly important thing for anatomy and physiology. So let's talk about some examples. This is one you saw in the other video that I showed before. So this example, the anatomy is the anatomy of the heart. The heart has chambers, valves, certain tissue layers that we'll talk about. The muscular layer is important, but it's not the only layer. It's connective tissue, nervous tissue, and then these tubes coming from it, of course. And that's the anatomy. And we're going to learn that. And then we're also going to talk about the physiology, which is the electrical changes from the nervous system that come in and then go across the heart. The blood pressure changes, so the pressure inside the heart itself, as well as the valves that leave the heart, we measure those. And those are going to change depending on how the heart contracts, the size of the vessels that it's going through, etc. So it's impossible to study the physiology without studying the anatomy. It's possible to study anatomy without physiology, but I think it makes it more interesting to do it together. So we're going to do it together, and it'll be good. Another example I have is the ear. So ear anatomy. This is the anatomy of the ear. What's cool about human anatomy, well, a lot of organisms, is that it's really complex and allows for specialization. So the eye is a really cool example of that. The ear is pretty cool too. You got this tube for air to come down. It's going to ring on the air is going to hit a drum and make the drum vibrate. That vibration makes these 3 little tiny bones. Look how cute those are. These are the internal, the ear, the drum bones of the internal ear, malleus, incus, and stapes, that are super tiny, and then they're going to vibrate and push vibrations onto this cochlea. Don't need to know this anatomy now. The point is that these structures, this snail-like thing here, is important for taking the external sound waves in the atmosphere and turning them into neural signals that our brain can process. So cool. And the structures of the ear are what allow us to do that. So structure function is, these are two, one more example actually of kind of this either organ level. So this is an example of the elbow joint. It's a hinge joint, kind of like a hinge on a door. Same idea. Hinge on a door is designed to work in this one direction. Unlike a different type of joint, that like a ball and socket joint that's meant to go rotationally. And we talk about joints, we'll talk about some of these other structures. The elbow is meant to do it right now yourself. It's meant to hinge. You can, go side to side a little bit with your elbow, but don't do that hard. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to be a hinge. And that is because of this really cool anatomy where the humerus, the bone up top here, has a ball. And then this ulna, this is your olecranon down here. That's actually your elbow itself, is this like bump down here. But this depression fits right in with the ball. So this is this interlocking thing that's like a hinge. And it goes one direction. It's held in place by ligaments, and we'll talk more about joints in the future. But a great example of structure function, hinge joint, just like you'd have on a door. Okay, and then this idea of structure function is not just true at the level of kind of the skeletal system here, or the ear organ, or the heart as an organ. It also is true down to the level of molecules. So this would be proteins. And this is showing an example of a membrane protein. So this blue thing here represents a protein that is embedded in the membrane, and it can bind to certain chemicals. It binds to some and not others. It binds to some better than others. We'll go into lots about proteins and binding. And when it binds to this certain one, let's say it binds the best of this blue ball here, when that binds, that changes the shape of the protein itself. So a change in structure of the protein is going to change its function, because now it's a different shape and stuff can go through it. So other chemicals can now pass through because it's open. So it's going from closed to open due to the binding of another molecule. So that this is a signal. And we'll talk, signaling, cell signaling is super important, super cool. Our endocrine system, nervous systems, how that all works, cells talk to each other locally, distance, is because we've got a stimulus, some signal that is going to change the structure of a protein and therefore change that protein's function. It's not just membrane receptors, right? So that signaling, it's also could be hemoglobin, the structure of hemoglobin. You heard of anemia, right? That's an altered structure of that hemoglobin protein that changes its function. We'll have other examples of changes in protein structure that change their function. So the idea of this is we're going all the way from the molecules that we just talked about, so that was the protein, and we want to talk about structure-function relationships at every level of this organization. So physiology really is the study from molecule to organism. Atoms are here as well, so atoms would be like carbon. We will talk about ions a lot, so sodium, potassium. Mostly we focus on the level of molecules though, so glucose, proteins are all molecules, all the way up to the multicellular organism level. That's right here. And that is, let me get my laser pointer, here we go. That's right here. That's where we kind of end anatomy and physiology, typically. In reality, so that we have a population of organisms, we've got a community, ecosystem, biosphere, we're getting into ecology. Those things are not irrelevant, right? The ecosystem you're in, the environment you're in is going to affect how your organ systems and you function. So we're going to kind of touch upon that in terms of environmental regulation, but primarily we focus on the functioning of the organism. And we'll focus on ants, just kidding, focus on humans as that multicellular organism. And then the organism is made up of multiple organ systems. Those are the systems that I showed in the previous lecture, right? You need to know those, the basic function of those organ systems that are going to work together to carry out body processes. So in a changing environment. So example, the heart along with the blood vessels would be an organ system. It allowed the heart's pumping and then distributing blood throughout the body. Each organ system is then made up of multiple organs. So the heart and the blood vessels, the brain and the spinal cord. And what defines an organ is somewhat variable. Endocrine system has a lot of organs. So all the endocrine glands, the pituitary gland, adrenal glands, thyroid gland, all those are organs that make up the endocrine system. So each organ carries out an independent but related function to the rest of the organ system. So each organ would be made up of more than one tissue type, which is the next one we're going down to, but is working together to carry out one single process typically. So the heart as an organ is made up of cardiac, muscle tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue. Those are all separate tissue types. Tissues are groups of cells that carry out a function together. So a specific function. So muscle tissue contracts. Muscle tissue in the heart contracts a certain way together. Nervous tissue fires electrical signals, fires action potentials. Nervous tissue exists in various parts of the body as parts of an organ. So the heart is made up of a lot of muscle tissue, some nervous tissue, some connective tissue. The brain is made up of a lot of nervous tissue, some connective tissue, some endocrine tissue, actually. So these tissues are dispersed throughout the whole body, but they make up organs and work together. And these tissues are then made up of cells. So cells are what actually determine how these tissues function, right? So there's different cell types. I'll talk about cell differentiation next week a little bit. So specialized cells that then create these different tissues. I think I have this picture. Yep, there they are. So this is the cell specialization piece. All life is made up of cells. The next lecture will be on what determines life, what is life. One key feature is life is made up of cells. That's why viruses are typically not considered alive. So cells are the smallest unit of life. And cells can be specialized. They have different genes that are transcribed and then translated into proteins. So they're different phenotypically. They look different, they act different, they have different proteins in them. And proteins are really what determines function of the cell. So muscle cells are going to have different proteins in them than blood cells. Fat cells have a lot of fat in them. The cell structures are going to be different and what's produced in that cell. Talk more about this next week, but the idea is these cells specialize, and this is what multicellular organisms have that single cell organisms don't have. It's a cell specialization that allows different tissues to form. These tissues then work together to form organs, and then so on. So this cell example here is a muscle cell. It has these striations. It's got a lot of hemoglobin. It's got a lot of actin and myosin for muscle contraction. It's specialized to be present in muscles. And these are the molecules I just said. So these are some of the myofilaments that are important for muscle contraction. Those are the molecules that are inside of those cells that make them function the way they do. So molecules, collection of molecules basically are what cells are. Cells are big lipid, not super big, sacs that contain specific molecules to that cell. I'll talk about that more next week. So that's basically the smallest level of organization we'll talk about is that proteins, glucose, that kind of thing. You should know, and there's some review that you'll do for homework next week in chapter 2, a little bit about what makes up molecules, that atoms combine together in different types of bonds to make up different types of molecules. And we'll go through some specific examples like phospholipids and certain proteins and glucose, and what makes glucose different than phospholipids, right? The different charges that come together with those bonds. Some of those we will go into a little more detail on, those atoms that form specific molecules we need to know about. So I actually have a walkthrough here going the opposite direction. So we had these cells, these muscle cells are going to group together to form muscle tissue. They're basically just glomming together, and we'll talk about the junctions that make those tissues form. Oops. And then those come together, those tissues, to make up the heart. So I want you to pause the video here a moment and fill in these blanks here. The heart is a blank that contains many blank types. I'm going to pause that. So the heart is an organ that's made up of many tissue types. So this is that organ level where a lot of muscle cells all group together, which is tissue, along with, you can see fat tissue there. There's connective tissue of various types and nervous tissue that make this thing beat, as well as endocrine input that make up the heart itself. So this is the level of the organ. The heart's job is to pump blood, but then it works within the cardiovascular system that includes not only the heart, but the other organs, primarily blood vessels that allow blood to flow throughout the body. So all of these organ systems are ones you've seen before. These are the major functions of each that you should study again. So hopefully we've done these things. One, provide an example of the relationship between structure and function. These terms here are fairly redundant with what you have up here, but reminding you that structure function really means anatomy and physiology. I went through several examples today. Then describe and relate the levels of organization of the human body, providing an example at each level. So you're going to describe those different levels of organization and providing examples of what those things are. So, for example, molecules, what is that? Glucose, especially ones we'll be talking about. Of course, you'll, as we go through the semester, add on to your list, because this is all builds on itself. It's all integrative. I don't want you just to know this, just to know it, because I want to test you on things. I want you to know this because this is a major theme of anatomy and physiology. When we talk about glycogen, I want you to think, what is that? That's a molecule. It's a polysaccharide. Cells, right? So we'll see lots of different types of cells, specific types throughout this semester. Tissues we'll go through, and we'll kind of go through in this order. We'll do a few organ systems, and then organism is just the whole shebang. So maybe the example of that is the human, primarily in this class. All right, please let me know what questions you have on this. Otherwise, I will see you next time.